Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades, patrons. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 39. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. I continue to thank all of you for your support. I just want to make a few notes before I get into today's commentary. It's been just slightly a year now since we lost our good friend and comrade, Michael Brooks, on July 20th, 2020. We miss him, of course, tremendously. We love him. We love the tremendous work he did in the brief time he had on this earth. You can never say it's too early for anyone to depart and join the ancestors. But certainly, Michael had many, many productive years and tremendous ideas before him. I know that for a fact because we discussed many of them together. We discussed collaborating on many projects. But Michael left us with a tremendous body of work, and people continue to learn from that. And as many of you know, I owe this podcast to Michael's stubbornness and insistence. He suggested this podcast and kept pressing me over a period of many, many months. He said, I consider you a mentor. I've learned so much from you, generally and specifically on Africa. You must share this with a wider audience as well on a regular basis. People shouldn't wait till I have you on my show. This is what he was saying. And every time he called me and we spoke, he would ask me, so when are you starting? And ironically, I was the last person that Michael interviewed for a podcast. And on the last episode, that was the last time we spoke. And I said at the very end of the show, Michael, I have an announcement. I'm going to launch that podcast you kept pressing me to do. Yeah, the world is very strange and mysterious in that way. Many of you, of course, got to know me because of my appearances on Michael's show. You know, in life, really nothing is accidental. We had appeared on some programs together by this Nigerian-owned outlet based here in New York. So it was hard to know each other. I didn't know his politics. He didn't know my politics. Because whenever we spoke, they would have us come on as guest commentators. And it would be, typical reaction to some event going on around the world. And that outlet was, I won't name it, but it's, a typical corporate outlet. So you only have some latitude in terms of what you can say because the audience won't understand it. The host won't understand it. So Michael could not know who I really was, and I could know who he was. But we appeared on those kind of shows because we still bring elements that people don't get to hear. But then when Michael started working on the Majority Report later on his own show, then I got to know his politics, and he got to know my politics. So it was meant to happen. And I welcome all of you who got to know me and now support this podcast as a result of my appearance on Michael's show. Michael, we will continue the work that you were involved in. Thank you for, you said I inspired you, but you truly inspired me as well. So we cherish your memory, and we love the work you did, and we love you. And of course, last year was also hard for me. As many of you remember, I lost my sister, my beloved Barbara. And a couple of episodes ago in the podcast, I announced that I had launched a foundation in her memory to support scholarships in Uganda for young girls heading to college. I'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks as we continue to set up this structure in case anybody is interested in supporting that. I also want to announce that going forward, in addition to revisiting discussion of my book again, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, I also intend to interview many Pan-Africans on the African continent and some who are here in the United States. So I will bring you those interviews as well as part of African History Club. So those are the key announcements I wanted to make today. Today, I want to discuss the crises in the African Union. There's no shortage of crises because, quite simply, the African Union and the organization that existed before that, it was called the Organization of African Unity. African Union succeeded it in 2002. It's none of those two organizations lived up to the promises, the expectations of hundreds of millions of Africans, or lived up to their names. And the current new crisis was really sparked on July the 22nd, when the African Union, which is the continental organization whose ultimate mission is to bring about the unification of the African continent, unite all the countries, on July the 22nd, admitted Israel as an observer member of the organization, which comprises all the 55 member nations in Africa. So this has sparked a very bitter reaction, particularly in some African countries like South Africa, for example, which is, of course, one of the leading countries on the continent. That such a decision should have been voted on by all the member countries. Instead, this was something decided by the chairperson of the African Union Commission. So his title would be the equivalent of a Secretary General of the United Nations. And his name is Mahamat Moussa Faki from Chad, a former foreign minister of Chad, and essentially a French puppet. So France has now been able to hijack the African Union to fulfill its mission. And in the case of France, most recently it was to endorse coups d'etat in Chad itself, and I discussed that in a previous episode, as well as in Mali last year. Because the African Union, by its own rules, whenever there's a military takeover in an African country, the country is automatically suspended from membership, and sanctions, economic sanctions, are imposed. And what is the reason for that? To discourage the recurrent military takeover of government in African countries. But in the case of the coup last year in Mali, it was not suspended, it was not sanctioned. And in the case of the coup this year, in April in Chad, the same thing, because France wanted the son of the previous dictator, Idris Deby, who had been killed, to succeed him. And he did succeed him. And he's also a general in the army, like his father was. His name is General Mahamat Deby. His father was Idris. So, following those two episodes, African civil society had been protesting in Chad, in Mali, and many other African countries where French neocolonialism is still very strong. So the African Union was dealing with those crises. And then now you have with the admission of Israel. And obviously, African countries oppose that because of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. The continued occupation, as well as the recurrent bombing campaigns. We saw what happened in May over the course of the brutal bombings, where 260 Palestinians were killed. And on the other side, 12 Israelis were killed in that conflict. So many Africans had been showing solidarity with the Palestinians and their cause. So obviously it was a coup, political diplomatic coup for Israel to basically pull the rug from under the feet of civil society in many African countries by getting this admission, membership as an observer, the courtesy of the chairperson, who, as I said earlier, is basically a French stooge, a French agent of neocolonialism. So many people say the African Union has failed, but it's really hard to say that it's failed because, as Walter Rodney said in one of his many lectures, the bourgeoisie in Africa and in the Caribbean, and by extension, perhaps anywhere in the world, as a class, unable to lead people anywhere except to destruction. That's what Walter Rodney said. And certainly we've seen manifestation of that all over Africa and in the Caribbean as well, as that was another area that Walter Rodney also studied. So it's hard to say they failed because they've in fact succeeded in serving the agenda and the class interest of the ruling elite in African countries, who are basically subcontractors on behalf of Western capital. But in order to really gain a sense of how disappointing this is, I want to look back briefly into the history, the formation of the Organization of African Unity, first of all, because the potential was tremendous and it remains tremendous. Tremendous in the sense that it is the only way that African countries can reposition themselves in terms of where they are currently located in the global system of production, where they are at the bottom of the chain, consumers of manufactured products and sellers of raw material. Sell cheap, buy industrial manufacturers at tremendously inflated prices. And the terms of trade keep worsening over the decades, meaning for the same basket of goods, of raw material, you need a lot more to buy the same quantities of manufactured products. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that impoverishment keeps increasing in African countries if this equation is maintained. And in order to change it, you need an organization like the African Union to be effective. You need it to succeed in actually uniting Africa so that Africans can protect their sovereignty and their resources and demand fair prices for their products when they're dealing with the powerful industrialized countries. That is the only way to transform the continent. You know, most countries won their independence in the 1960s. At that time, the arrangement was what was concluded at the Berlin Conference when Africa was partitioned. And we've discussed this before, in 1884-85. Producers of raw materials and cheap labor and consumers of manufactured products. That was 1884. That was 1960s at the time of independence. And that remains today the same arrangement in the 21st century. So that is why Nkrumah had insisted that Africa must unite immediately at the first meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 1963 in May, when the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was formed. Nkrumah knew the potential, the power of the OAU and the power of the United States of Africa. Nkrumah, tried his best. He had a very passionate speech in which he broke down the dangers of not uniting. He said in subsequent years, it will become much more difficult when the leaders become used to that trappings of being called Excellency, President, Prime Minister. Our only chance is to do it now. When Nkrumah was not only dealing with fellow Africans, he was actually fighting against the United States, against France, against Britain, who did not want to see a United States of Africa, for fear that they would not be able to dominate and control the resources of Africa. We discussed in a previous podcast how these three nations worked very aggressively to get rid of Nkrumah. And I read some of the State Department memos in a previous podcast, how they colluded and worked together very effectively to get Kwame Nkrumah overthrown. And before he was overthrown, the prospects of unity was really doomed when these three powers managed to split Africa into blocks. Those who supported immediate unification, led by Ghana, of course, they were referred to, as I discussed earlier in a previous podcast, as the Casablanca Group. And it also included Morocco, included Egypt at the time under Abdel Nasser Gamal, who was a socialist. With countries like Guinea under Sekou Touré. And the other bloc was the Monrovia bloc, which of course included Liberia, whose capital was Monrovia. Liberia was basically an extension of U.S. interest in Africa. Included major countries also like Nigeria. So once the split occurred, it had terrible consequences. Africa became a testing ground, a fighting ground for the Cold War, with the U.S. supporting autocrats on one hand, and the then Soviet Union supporting autocrats as well. So the lost opportunity to unite, to start building a cohesive national Pan-African nation state, to mobilize resources for industrialization, all that was lost. Plus, colonialism lasted in some African territories for much longer than it ever should have. In the case of the former Portuguese colonies until 1975, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau. And in the case of Zimbabwe, which was then Rhodesia, until 1980, even though most African countries had won independence in the 1960s. And in the case of South Africa, not until 1994, when Mandela was elected as the first African president. All these could have been avoided had Africa been able to unite. Shortly after the OAU was formed in 1963. So the current organization, the AU, African Union, has not fared any much better. And it's not shocking if you look at how the AU is financed. In 2016, for example, 60% of its budget came from the United States, the European Union, Canada, China, and some of the Scandinavian countries. I think the politics would be probably much better if all of the funding came from the Scandinavian countries. They don't have a history of aggressive, disruptive imperialism in Africa. But be that as it may, that is what you have before you. The structure that is supposedly meant to unite Africa so it can break away from neo-colonial control, which is now, of course, imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. So they don't need to have European governors in Africa anymore. They just have African puppet subcontractors calling themselves presidents and prime ministers. And then they have the IMF and the World Bank as the hitman. And that is what prevails today. And that is why it was not shocking for Israel to be able to succeed into manipulating the French agent, Mahmoud Moussa Faki, who is the chairperson of the African Union Commission, into admitting it as an observer. And of course, Israel has been trying to get this accomplished for almost 20 years now. Israel was an observer in the Organization of African Unity, but after it was succeeded by the African Union, African countries opposed admitting Israel because of its continued defiance of the UN resolutions over Palestine and the continued occupation and the continued massive bombing attack campaigns. And now Israel wants membership because now the Palestinian Authority has observer status. So now it can counter the Palestinian Authority. It can try to get Africans to move away from having a united position and stand in support of the Palestinians. That's why it was a major diplomatic success for Israel, but it will probably have ramifications because South Africa is demanding that the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mr. Faki, address all the heads of states, all the member countries. And there's indication that there's a lot of pushback and demand that actually that admission of Israel be reversed. So we will see what will happen down the line. But let me now speak about what are the prospects actually of changing this trajectory in Africa. Because so long as the current crop of ruling class continue in leadership in African countries, nothing will change. Things will just get worse. Impoverishment, as population grows, as the young population grows in particular. But sometimes you actually need things to really get bad before things start to change, before you might see the kind of radical transformation that most African countries actually need. And that is where I have some hope, actually, because the young people are becoming much more vocal in all these countries. We saw a protest in Chad when France imposed a new dictator. We saw a protest in Mali. We saw a protest in Senegal. We've seen protests in almost all the former French colonies, who remain very strong neo-colonies of France, which still controls their currency, by the way, and trade pattern, and control most of the major utilities and banks and major companies, like the phone companies in most of those countries as well. But there's vigorous protests. And this is also one reason why I say I'm very hopeful. There is now talk, which is something that I've been advocating for a long time as well, of the formation of a People's African Union. So civil society organizations, grassroots organizations from all over Africa coming together and starting to host their own annual meetings at the same time that the African Union is hosting its neo-colonial annual meetings. I think this is good development, and it holds much potential. And I'm going to be discussing this, in fact, with a guest in my next podcast. He also writes for Black Star, and he's based in Zimbabwe. He's a journalist. His name is Sifelani Siko. He'll be my guest in the next episode, episode number 40, when we discuss the prospects of a People's African Union. There's great demand for it because hundreds of millions of Africans are dissatisfied with the neo-colonial instrument that the current African Union has become. So I'll save that discussion for the next podcast, and I will now bring this episode to a close. As always, I thank all of you for continued support, and we will continue learning more about our beloved African continent going forward. Stay strong, stay healthy, stay Pan-African.